Fariha was 28 years old and had, for the first 6 months of her daughter Amina's life, spoken to her almost entirely in Urdu. This was not a choice she had made carefully. It was simply the language her mouth reached for when her small warm baby smiled at her at 4 in the morning. It was the language of every song she knew, every rhyme her own mother had once sung to her, every soft thing she wanted to say to a small person whose small face was the whole shape of her world at that moment. She loved her daughter in Urdu. She had never considered loving her in any other language. Then on a slow Tuesday afternoon when Amina was almost 7 months old and had fallen asleep in her small cot after a long feed, Fariha sat on her bed with a cup of tea and read an article on her phone that changed the small direction of her days. The article said that babies who heard 2 languages regularly from the first year of life became naturally bilingual, and that this bilingualism gave them small advantages that lasted their whole life. It said that the parent who was going to speak the second language to the baby had to speak it warmly, easily, naturally, in the small, unplanned moments of the day. And it said, kindly and clearly, that a parent who translated every English sentence in their head before saying it aloud to their baby would not be able to sustain it, because the small, unplanned moments of a baby's day did not wait for translation. Fariha put her phone down and stared at the small cot across the room. She had never in her life been able to think in English. Her English, in her head, existed only as a series of small, careful sentences she had to build first in Urdu and then translate. It was accurate, it was almost always grammatical, it was never fast enough for a baby. She tried that evening to speak to Amina in English. She said in careful, slow English, "Hello, my baby. How was your afternoon?" It sounded, even to her own ears, like a woman reading a book to a stranger. Amina looked at her for a long moment with the puzzled, patient eyes of a small human who could tell, even at not quite 7 months, that something in her mother's voice was not the same. Fariha stopped. She switched back to Urdu. Amina smiled. That night she found a small, quiet video on her phone made by a woman with a soft voice, who said something that Fariha had never heard anyone say quite that way before. The woman said that learning to think in a language was not the same as learning to speak it, and that most learners had spent years working on the second without ever working on the first. She said that thinking in a language was a small skill built through 5 small daily habits, and that if a learner practiced those 5 habits, they could, in a few months, begin to think in English almost without meaning to. The woman explained the 5 habits, gently, one at a time. Fariha wrote them down on the first page of a small notebook she kept on the shelf above the changing table. Name things, talk to yourself, ask yourself real questions, react, dream. She began the next morning. She carried Amina from her cot to the sitting room, as she did every morning, and instead of narrating the small journey in Urdu as she usually did, she said, softly in English, "This is the door. This is the corridor. This is the window. This is the fan. Here is the sofa." Amina looked at everything Fariha pointed at with the calm curiosity of a small child who did not yet understand which language her mother was speaking. Fariha felt briefly ridiculous. Then she felt something else. She felt that she was practicing, and that Amina, who did not need her mother's English to be beautiful, was the perfect small classroom. She kept going. She named things all day. The kettle, the teapot, the small yellow spoon, the cup, the tomato, the onion, the soap, the towel, the clock on the wall, the lizard on the ceiling. Slowly, over the following weeks, the names began to arrive in her head before they left her mouth. She was no longer translating. She was, in a small, quiet way, seeing things directly in English. She added the second habit in the 3rd week. She began to talk to herself in English while she did chores. She said aloud in slow English, "I am washing the small blue bib. I am folding the small yellow blanket. I am making a cup of tea. I am tired, but I am happy." She was at first mildly embarrassed to be a grown woman talking to herself in a language she barely spoke aloud. Then she realized that mothers had been talking to themselves in every language on earth for as long as babies had needed watching, and she stopped being embarrassed. Amina watched her from the small mat on the floor and cooed occasionally. Her small cooing began, without Fariha meaning it to feel like conversation. By the 6th week she had added the 3rd habit. She asked herself real questions in English throughout the day, aloud when Amina was awake, and silently when Amina was sleeping. Where did I put the small hairbrush? What time is her next feed? What should I make for dinner? Is it going to rain today? Do I need to buy more nappies? These were not exam questions. They were the small, real questions of a small, real life. She answered herself in English, in the small, quiet voice of a woman who had begun to enjoy her own company in a new language. The fourth habit came almost by accident. She was making tea one afternoon when the water spilled slightly on her hand, and she said aloud without thinking, "Ouch." She stopped stirring the tea. She had never in her life said ouch in English. Ouch had lived until that afternoon in a small English textbook she had once memorized. Now it lived, apparently, inside her and had come out warmly of its own accord. Over the following weeks, she began to notice more small English reactions arriving unbidden. Oh no, when she dropped a spoon. Ah, when the cool water touched her face in the shower. Yea, in a small, quiet voice, when Amina finished her whole bottle. Yuck, when she opened a nappy she had been dreading. Wow, when Amina rolled over for the first time on her own. Her body had begun to react in English, and she had not asked it to. The fifth habit was the strangest. It came in the small hour before sleep, when Amina had finally settled and Fariha lay in bed with her eyes closed and her body tired. She began, on the recommendation of the small, quiet video, to imagine the next day in English. Tomorrow, she thought, quietly, I will take her for a small walk in the park. We will see the ducks. She likes the ducks. I will need to bring the small blue blanket because it is a little cold. It surprised her at first that she could do this without translating. It surprised her more when she realized that some of her dreams over the following weeks had begun to arrive in English. Small dreams, small ordinary sentences from her sleeping mind in a language she was still learning to think in during the day. It was the strangest and warmest feeling of her adult life. By the time Amina was 9 months old, Fariha spoke to her in English for most of the day and in Urdu when she wanted the soft, warm feel of her own mother tongue. It did not feel forced anymore. It did not feel like translation. She said warmly, "Hello, my little one. Are you hungry? Is your tummy full now? Let me clean your small face. You are the best girl in the whole world." Amina cooed back in her own private language, which was neither English nor Urdu, and which Fariha understood perfectly in either. By the time Amina was 18 months old, she had begun to say her first small English words alongside her first small Urdu words. Duck, cup, milk, mama, papa, water, bird. She looked at her mother when she said them, with the small, pleased face of a child who had been taught 2 songs and was allowed to choose which one to hum. Fariha, watching her, understood that she had given her daughter something she had not been able to give her in Urdu alone. Not a better language, only a bigger world. She kept the 5 habits going, even as Amina began to walk and talk. She named the world in English. She talked to herself in English while she cleaned. She asked herself real questions in English. She reacted in English without meaning to. She still, sometimes, dreamed small English dreams. English, which had once lived only in her school textbooks, now lived in her kitchen, in her bedroom, in her small, quiet head, as she stirred a cup of tea at 3 in the afternoon. A year later, her younger sister, Nabila, who had just given birth to her first son, and who was worried about how to raise him bilingual when her own English was still stuck in translation, sat with Fariha at a family lunch and asked her quietly how she had done it. Fariha thought for a long moment. She looked at her sister, who was holding a small, warm baby and who reminded her painfully of a version of herself. Do not try to speak English to him first, she said. Try to think in English first. Every morning, walk him around your house and name things aloud. Talk to yourself in English while you clean. Ask yourself small, real questions in English. Let yourself react in English when a spoon falls or a bird flies past the window. And at night, before you sleep, imagine tomorrow in English. 5 small habits. In 3 months, you will not be translating anymore. In 6 months, you will be someone who thinks in 2 languages instead of 1. Nabila frowned. 5 habits, she said, that is all. Fariha smiled the small smile of a woman who had learned everything the slow way.